We are all eagerly awaiting the next Auburn men's basketball season, but we continue to get news about how this particular season, the schedule, will take shape. We have some news regarding an opponent and when we'll actually be playing them. Let's talk about who that is and what it means for the program. But before we do that, I want to welcome you back to the channel. Whether you're a member of the Auburn family or a fan of another persuasion, this is the E2C network where we cover the whole of the Auburn experience. We might tend to be Auburn sports heavy here, but if it's orange and blue, it is what we do. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any content, and thank you to members of our booster club like Co and Dame who help produce videos like this. I actually quite enjoy this time of the season because we're starting to get the schedule pieced together, and it is a little bit of a puzzle that I like to do myself. As we get little bits and pieces of information, we get to kind of put together the picture of what it might look like ultimately. And that's even what we did on our last video where we broke down the latest announcement of Auburn playing USC and how it would affect this announcement that we're going to be talking about in this particular video. And that announcement is officially, we already knew that Auburn and Washington were going to be playing this season, but we didn't know when. But Auburn and the University of Washington will be playing in Seattle on December 21, which is a Wednesday if I have my calendar correct. But we do not have a set time right now. A couple things to keep in mind about this matchup: that this is actually the completing of an agreement for a home and home series that started with Washington way back in 2018 with that season, which was the second one of the game at that particular time. And it took us all the way to 2022 to actually complete the home and away. Obviously, I'm sure the COVID year messed a little bit of the scheduling up, or it probably would have happened a little bit recently, but we're no stranger to sometimes these home and home series getting a little bit of a pushback in terms of when they're actually completed. It's happened a few times before. Now, we're going to talk more about these particular things in just a little bit, but this is actually the second Pac-12 team, as we've already talked about, with USC, us playing them before this game in the schedule for this season thus far. It's also going to be important for a resume overall. Now, right now, when you look at the way too early top 25 projections out there, Washington's not really high up there at the moment, but they are usually pretty well respected as a basketball program, and they were in 2018 when we played them, when they were ranked in the top 25. Speaking of that 2018 team, I want to talk about them. Not specifically just the Washington team, but that Auburn team, because if you all remember correctly, we all didn't know what we had in store for us, because the 2018-19 team was that Final Four run team that we all loved so much and really kind of felt like the final validation that Bruce Pearl and Auburn was a thing of beauty, that connection and that relationship that has developed to what it is right now. But if I think back to that game, I was actually there, and I was lucky enough to have tickets and pretty good seats for that matchup, which was heralded as a pretty good one, even though most people expected Washington to maybe wipe the floor with Auburn by the time the game was done. They came in ranked in the top 25, and they were expected to win, as I said. However, the Tigers were the ones that put the walloping on them, 88-66. It was an interesting dynamic because I remember I was sitting amongst a bunch of Washington fans, and you could tell, not just on the team, but with the fans, there was I would call it a little bit of an arrogance factor with them thinking they were going to come into an SEC program. Because let's be honest, traditionally, the Pac-12, the Big 12, the Big 10, the ACC, those are the ones that typically get known for basketball. And only until recently has the SEC risen outside of just Kentucky in its prominence as a conference when it comes to basketball. So there was a little bit of maybe taking this lightly, and they paid the price for it. It was interesting to watch the Washington fans leave with a little bit more respect for the Auburn Tigers. Granted, they were playing what would eventually be a Final Four team, but Washington fans and team, I hope you learned your lesson. Now, let's talk about what this means for the basketball program going forward. And we can talk about it in terms of what the schedule looks like going forward and making some estimation on that. But I want to start off with talking about resume. You hear about me talk about that a lot because it's very important when it comes to securing your place as part of postseason in college basketball, especially when it comes to your non-conference performance and the strength of that schedule. Well, right now, Auburn's actually developing a pretty good schedule overall that looked to be kind of slow going to start off with because they were part of the Cancun Challenge, which really didn't seem to be all that exciting. Not that the opponents aren't going to be good there, it's just not to the caliber of some of the other events such as a Maui Invitational or the Battle for Atlantis that they've been a part of previously. But what this does with the official announcement of this game, even though we knew it was coming, was make a reality of what could potentially be an amazing run out west, all on the road for the Auburn Tigers through the Pac-12. USC, as we talked about in a previous video, is probably going to be the stronger of the two opponents, just kind of guessing how things are going right now with the way the programs look at the moment. But Washington is not a pushover either, and especially with it being on the road. If Auburn can go through that, sweeping both those teams, they are going to set themselves up very nicely for the rest of the season and with the rest of their conference play, which probably is going to be very, very tough. I want to talk about the schedule, and again, we knew this was coming. This just clarifies where it falls into place. And if you look back at our previous video, I believe I pretty much guessed where this was going to be. I don't know if I had the exact date right, but I had the week and at least the midweek speculation for where it's going to land on the schedule. So as of this moment, we have a schedule for non-conference that looks just like this. George Mason on November 7th, USF on November 11th, Bradley at the Cancun Challenge on November 22nd, Northwestern or Liberty, whoever wins in the Cancun Challenge, on November 23rd. Then you have on November 27th, St. Louis, followed up with this trip out to the Pac-12 at USC on December 18th, and then at Washington, as we just talked about, on December 21st. Now, typically in a non-conference schedule, there is 12, usually 13 games, and most of those are happening before you start conference play. The thing is, though, is that the SEC and the Big 12 usually have an agreement to do a Big 12 SEC challenge each year. Now, there's not as many teams in the Big 12 as there are in the SEC, so we don't know yet specifically if Auburn's going to be part of it or one of the teams from the SEC that will be left out of it. But that's going to be an integral part of us guessing what the rest of the schedule is going to look like, because with 7 games now confirmed and a potential of 13 total in non-conference play, that leaves 6 games left to fill in the schedule. And I've looked back at previous schedules to try to compare and contrast and guess what the rest of the schedule might look like going forward based on who we scheduled and the current strength of that schedule. Let's first talk about this gap between the St. Louis game, which, by the way, they are currently projected in a lot of the early top 25, so don't look past that team, and that'll also be an important part of the resume. But between that St. Louis game at Auburn and the trip out west to take on USC and eventually Washington, there's probably a gap big enough there for about 3, possibly 4 games. Now, who these teams will be is obviously up in the air at this point. I'm sure there's discussions happening, but my guess is this, that you're probably going to see 3 mid-major, lower-tier programs, and I don't mean that as a disrespect, but just usually that's kind of how it works out right after finals and in the middle of all the holiday stuff, especially when you've got a road trip scheduled already that's going to be tough, like USC and Washington. But I wouldn't be surprised for one of those games, maybe that 4th game, to be a upper mid-major program, one that you typically see in the NCAA tournament every year, or maybe even Auburn getting invited to what these things are called showcases. It happened last year in Atlanta, where it's not necessarily a tournament, but they invite a bunch of the big teams together, we'll call them big teams, quote unquote, to participate in a showcase event to encourage a lot of fans to come to this particular area. Now, most of those have probably already been decided, so I doubt that will happen, but it wouldn't shock me. The other space that we can talk about filling out the schedule is at the very end of it. I do think that this trip out west is pretty much going to bookend their non-conference play, with the exception of maybe one more game against probably a lesser opponent at home for Auburn right before they kick off conference play right at the turn of the new year. Sometimes they start on December 29th, 30th, 31st, or sometimes they start right as the new year changes over. Right in there is where you expect conference play to start. But there's also, we've already talked about it, the event of Big 12 SEC Challenge that might take place middle of conference play. I know it's confusing, but I kind of like it. But that's what you can expect, possibly us speculating the rest of the schedule to look like, and we'll keep an eye out or an ear out for what other announcements will be coming out in the future. So that's my thoughts on this schedule update, and I want to hear from you down in the comments section below. What do you think about it and what it means for Auburn basketball this season? Before you head out, I want to remind you of a couple things. If you haven't, please do smash that like button if you enjoyed this type of content, and if you want more from us, be sure to hit the subscribe along with that notification bell so you don't miss any uploads or live streams. There's ways to help support our content listed in the description, such as becoming a channel member by hitting that join button below, or even hitting the thanks button down there in the video as well. Also, you can check out patreon.com/E2C Network to join the Booster Club and get yourself some perks for supporting our content. Thank you for tuning into the E2C Network, where we cover the whole of the Auburn experience. War Eagle.